following us on the Zoom application. In this session, we organized four panelists. In fact, one of our panelists has apologized for not being able to attend, and we'll give each panelist 15 minutes. And I would like to draw your attention that you can use the Q&A feature to pose your questions to the panelists. And also the panelists and participants from the center can use the raise hand feature. Look forward to the proceedings of this session. This session is entitled The GCC's Relations with Iran. The first speaker will be Dr. John Calabrese, who is a professor at the American University in Washington and a senior scholar at the Middle East Institute, where he directs the Middle East Asia Project, and he serves as the book review editor of the Middle East Journal. He is the author of many publications like China's Changing Relations with the Middle East. Um,
تفضل دكتور جون.
Dr. John, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to participate in this conference and for the opportunity to wear a necktie for the first time in 8 months. In my paper, which is titled The United States and the Gulf, Trapped in Transition, I argued that the mixed messages and pendulum swings in U.S. Gulf policy in recent years are rooted in and have further fueled deep questioning and an ongoing debate within the United States about America's role in the region and indeed in the world. I further argue that, like the US, which appears trapped in transition from global primacy, that GCC-Iran relations are locked in confrontation. In my view, breaking this impasse requires decisive US re-engagement in Gulf affairs, led by vigorous, sustained diplomacy and that promotes intra-GCC reconciliation and supports efforts aimed at tempering the Saudi-Iran strategic rivalry. The paper doesn't discuss the prospects for or barriers to the US recasting its role in Gulf affairs in the manner I've just suggested, but since drafting the paper in August, I have given some thought to them and would be happy to discuss those aspects in the Q&A. So let's get started. As I see it, the security situation in the Gulf is tenuous at best. The rift between Iran and the Gulf Arab monarchies is both a symptom and a cause of a chronic state of conflict that dates back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. This is a condition successive American administrations have sought to improve, but whose policies, notably the US-led invasion of Iraq and the botched post-Saddam reconstruction enterprise, in my opinion, worsened. Since then, GCC countries have adopted various approaches to push back against Iran's perceived regional ascendancy and hostility. But assertive go-it-alone policies haven't seemed to work. Multilateral initiatives haven't seemed to gotten any traction, and efforts to develop a collective deterrent force have failed. A glaring example, it seems to me, of the gap between ends and means is the military intervention in Yemen launched in March 2015. This misadventure has yet to achieve the stated goals of defeating the Houthis and restoring Yemen's legitimate government, but has resulted instead in a fractured coalition and worse, a humanitarian catastrophe. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's maximum pressure sanctions campaign has weakened Iran's economy, but hasn't caused Iran to change its behavior or the Iranian people to change their government. On the contrary, it produced a counterreaction in the form of a maximum resistance policy that markedly increased the risk of military confrontation, and that has led Iran to expand its stockpile of low-enriched uranium. Since US-Iran tensions spiked in January when an airstrike killed Qasem Soleimani, there's been a pause, I guess you can say, in overt hostilities. But this respite is due as much to the COVID-19 pandemic as to anything else. So how did we get to this place? Of the numerous missteps either committed by or ascribed to the United States in discharging its role as guarantor of Gulf security, none has been as consequential as the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Far from having imposed a new regional order, the US intervention contributed to more regional instability and to Iran's regional ascendancy. Since then, including in its responses to the 2011 Arab Spring uprisings, the policies of the US have done little, in my estimation, to convince Gulf partners of America's competence or of its long-term commitment to the region. Coupled with a rebalance to Asia, these policies fed into the perception within the Gulf of US disengagement, heightening their security anxieties and their ambitions. Yet it's important to emphasize that the security deficit in the Gulf, at least from my perspective, stems not just from US policy missteps and deficiencies, but also from the pathologies and tendencies of the regional states themselves. Since the 2011 uprisings, America's Gulf security partners have worked to reverse the momentum of Arab political reform and to exploit sectarian fears. The resulting regional alignments and proxy conflicts have exposed and sharpened intra-GCC perceptual and policy divergences. So the GCC countries find themselves sharply at odds with each other, locked in confrontation with Iran, and seized by the twin fears of entrapment and abandonment by the United States. Looking ahead, the US could be a key player in arresting some of these trends, but the US policy community has been trapped in a debate about America's role in the world, a debate where the false choice often posed is between disengagement and a quest to sustain American primacy, and where internationalism is frequently conflated with military interventionism. America's unresolved debate about its role in the world has been reflected in its statements and conduct regarding the Middle East, and has in turn contributed to the steady erosion of its credibility among traditional US Gulf security partners. Credibility is a function of both perceived capabilities and perceived resolve. Unless US leaders overcome the resolve problem, America's Gulf partners will not find gestures aimed at strategic reassurance to be credible, nor as a result will the US be able to assuage their concerns or to temper their ambitions. Gulf partners appear convinced that the US has one foot out the door. Yet, paradoxically, US GCC security and defense relations remain extensive. America's national fatigue has translated into a strong aversion to launching new wars and a strong desire for restrained engagement, but it has not, as commonly assumed, translated into a strong popular mandate for neo-isolationism. The Trump administration has repeated the pattern of its predecessors, sending mixed signals that have reinforced the impression that the US disengagement from the region is inevitable, though perhaps not imminent, thereby undercutting American credibility. This has encouraged both risk-taking and hedging by America's Gulf security partners, who are looking to the US to be even more forceful in deterring Iran, and at the same time, to be more careful about provoking Iran. Indeed, the GCC states have no good choices. They've been unable to create effective joint military structures and are not able to confront significant threats in their strategic environment on their own. With the exception of UAE, GCC militaries can't operate independently. Security diversification schemes have provided only limited returns. The attacks on Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia oil infrastructure cast doubt on whether the massive weapons purchases of recent years can protect essential assets. And though Gulf leaders may be skeptical about American steadfastness, no other major power is currently interested in or capable of filling the US role. Even if the US is in terminal decline, it'll continue to play a central role in world affairs for the foreseeable future. This fixation on whether the US is disengaging and the preference expressed for it by some obscures the need for a fundamental reassessment of American foreign policy in the region, including a clear articulation of how the Gulf fits into US strategic priorities. In my opinion, it's possible to conceive of, to build a strong case for, and to implement a form of American engagement in the Gulf and a partnership model that's restrained, sustainable, and effective. The price of continued US involvement in the Gulf, properly crafted, need not be onerous. In fact, in recent years, the cost burden of American engagement has shifted, with the US financial outlay and military deployments having dramatically declined, and the defense costs borne by the Gulf states themselves having significantly risen. Furthermore, it's important to recognize that continued American engagement in Gulf affairs, including maintaining a modest military presence, could yield strategic benefits for the United States. But allowing for a modest military presence that's essential for deterrence and reassurance purposes is not to endorse a military-first approach or a license for interventionism. It's possible to strike a balance between the judicious use of limited force where core interests are engaged and embarking on forever wars. Staying and fighting are not synonymous. Finally, it's crucially important to engage all the instruments of American power, in the Gulf as elsewhere, especially by elevating US diplomacy and by tackling military and non-military security issues with equal vigor and determination. Putting diplomacy first, in the interest of helping put the Gulf on a more stable and secure footing over the longer term, requires that the US re-engage Iran in nuclear diplomacy. It also requires strong and sustained encouragement of intra-GCC dialogue and facilitation of their efforts to reach an accommodation. And it requires developing an agenda in consultation with Gulf partners that focuses on regional issues, especially on non-traditional security issues, but also on those that have no security content whatsoever. Issues that are non-threatening, that could incentivize cooperation, that might attract Iranian participation. Nevertheless, just as there's no right-sized American military footprint in the Gulf, there's no magic formula for American diplomacy that can guarantee regional security. Ultimately, it's the regional states that hold the keys to unlocking the fears, the apprehensions, the mistrust that drives their insecurity. Where the US can be most helpful is not in the futile quest for quick breakthroughs, but employing creativity, guile, and persistence to reduce the scope for further escalation at moments of crisis, to encourage and support conciliation and tension reduction initiatives both within the GCC and between the Gulf Arab states and Iran. Absent such a course correction by the US, it seems to me unlikely that the climate of animosity and contention in the Gulf will dissipate. Recent patterns in the security-seeking behavior of America's Gulf partners, Turkey, and Iran reflect a shared impression of US neglect and a determination to compensate for and to exploit it by projecting power abroad. Attempts by interventionist regional actors are unlikely to be any more successful in imposing a durable regional order than was the US in imposing a hegemonic order at the height of its power. Nor can conduct by Iran or Saudi Arabia that one of them perceives as a bid by the other to establish regional hegemony be expected to accomplish much other than to reproduce insecurity throughout the Middle East and North Africa. There's an urgent need, it seems to me, for a renewed US engagement and the recasting of its role in Gulf affairs. The initial steps would be for the US to acknowledge not just its limitations, but the power and leverage it still possesses. Indeed, American interests would be better served and the prospects for enhancing Gulf security markedly improved were the US to invest the same time and energy in practicing preventive diplomacy as it is lately devoted to coercive diplomacy. It's not inconceivable that the Biden administration will follow this path. If it does, the US will have made some headway in restoring its credibility, setting ground rules for a new security partnership model, as well as reestablishing and rebranding itself as a new kind of global leader. Thanks a lot for your attention.
شكرا جزيلا جون. إذن هناك فرصة جديدة للولايات المتحدة لتجديد
a new opportunity for the United States to redefine its role in the region. Thank you, John. Our next speaker will be Dr. Zahid Shahab Ahmed.
Dr. Zahid Shahab Ahmed is a research fellow at Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization, Deakin University. Prior to that, he was assistant professor at the Center for International Peace and Stability, National University of Sciences and Technology in Pakistan. His work focuses on political developments and group democratization, authoritarianism, and political Islam, and interstate relations in South Asia and the Middle East. Dr. Zahid will present his paper. And now, Dr. Zahid, you have 15 minutes. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mahjoob. And thanks to the Arab Center. This is, in fact, my third time presenting a paper in Arab Center's conferences, and first time presenting virtually as well. So it's a very different kind of a feeling than visiting Doha and interacting with everyone face to face, and which is very, something I've always appreciated. So my paper basically focuses on the relations between the GCC states and Iran and the Pakistan factor. So how Pakistan plays any role in terms of Iran's relations with the GCC countries. Pakistan's relations with the GCC states have been tested by their often, or in some cases, conflictual relations with Iran. So some of the GCC states, they do not enjoy good relations with Iran. And as John has already talked about this, So I'll move on and I'll focus mainly on three countries from the GCC, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain in terms of their relationship with Iran and how and to what extent Pakistan has played any role in terms of their conflictual relations. For Pakistan, I think it's important that because it has the land border with Iran. At the same time, Pakistan is home to the second largest Shia population after Iran. So there is the sectarian dimension as well, and it suits Pakistan's purpose to claim some kind of neutrality or to claim that it can play the role of a mediator in terms of Iran's relations with GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and also Bahrain. So this is kind of position that Pakistan has taken, and I will focus on these options for Pakistan and to what extent they are really feasible. So that will be the focus of my presentation. But first, I wanted to talk about the key principles of Pakistan's foreign policy and how they have sort of evolved since 1947, when Pakistan achieved its independence from the Britain. And then in 1947, of course, the dynamics were very different because Pakistan was the biggest Muslim state back then, because Indonesia achieved its independence 2 years after. So naturally, the inclination in Pakistan was to somehow lead the Ummah. So there was this desire, due to which Pakistan had also organized several international conferences focusing on pan-Islamism during 1947 to the mid-50s even. And most of them actually did not lead to any meaningful sort of outcome as far as Pakistan's own desire was concerned. But as far as the guiding principles are concerned, there's a key principle in Pakistan's constitution that asks the policy makers to focus on having good relations with the Muslim countries. So that has been a central aspect of how Pakistan has looked at its relations, you can say, with the Ummah or Muslim majority states. And during the 50s also, when the constitution was formulated, pan-Islamism was at the heart of this. So this is the kind of prism through which Pakistan has looked at its relations with Iran and with the GCC countries at the same time, despite their conflicts, especially conflicts involving Saudi Arabia and Iran. And in one of my recent papers, basically, I focus on Pakistan's neutrality in terms of Iran and Saudi Arabia and how Pakistan claims to be neutral, but of course it is clearly leaning towards the Sunni majority countries in the Gulf, especially the Saudi Arabia. So there is this bit of contradiction, but I'll also talk about how that suits Pakistan's purpose and how that is kind of one of the most feasible options that Pakistan can use. Nothing has tested Pakistan's foreign policy more than the conflicts within the Muslim world. Naturally, because it wants to have good relations with all of them, and often neutrality is seen by some actors as you taking a side. So that has created some difficulties for Pakistan. We saw that in the case of Qatar GCC conflict as well, how Pakistan was pressurized to take a side. We saw that in the case of the issue of Pakistan sending troops to for the Saudi-led coalition to fight against the Houthis as well. So there have been several occasions, but what Pakistan has done consistently is to act as a mediator. So in the past also, during the Iran-Iraq war, General Ziaul Haq of Pakistan was engaged in shuttle diplomacy. And he visited Tehran, although that sort of mediation did not lead to any meaningful sort of outcome because Iranian officials blamed Iraq for the aggression. And when he went on to discuss with Iraq, there was also the similar kind of blame game there as well. But this approach has been quite consistent from Islamabad's point of view, that it has to mediate. And now I'll move on to just briefly talk about the kind of relationships Pakistan has with three relevant GCC states here. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, because they have conflictual relations with Iran, which is Pakistan's neighbor. So I'll just focus on them here. With Saudi Arabia, of course, there are historic relations. Pakistan, as the second biggest Muslim state, has cultural relations as well. The number of pilgrims who go to Saudi Arabia and all of that. There is a lot of aid that comes from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan. Another dimension is that Pakistan is economically dependent on Saudi Arabia for two key reasons. One is because of the remittances coming through Pakistan's workforce in the kingdom. And the second is, of course, Saudi Arabia has been quite generous for decades, giving not only aid, but also oil at discounted prices and so on. So some of that has changed recently, but I don't think so that is going to harm the long-lasting kind of cooperation that both countries have. One example is that the Saudi-led military coalition is headed by Pakistan's former Chief of Army Staff, General Raheel Sharif, who has been there since the start of this military coalition. And in terms of other aspects, that Pakistan has very good security cooperation with Saudi Arabia. At any single point, I think there have been between 10 to 15,000 Pakistani soldiers in Saudi Arabia on different sort of assignments, training the Saudi troops and so on. So Pakistani military is a key factor in this relationship. So anything that the civilian government has to decide has to go through the military leadership. And similar is the case of Pakistan's relationship with the UAE. It is economically dependent by virtue of the aid and by virtue of also remittances coming from 1.2 million Pakistani workforce in the United Arab Emirates. That's a huge workforce. And imagine if the UAE sends them back, how Pakistan is going to give them jobs, and so there is some level of fear in Islamabad to also maintain good relations. There is also defense cooperation similar to the case of Saudi Arabia. What has changed recently, and we have seen in the case of the UAE normalizing relations with Israel, although Pakistan has not openly commented on it or objected to it, there is some kind of, I would say, invisible pressure on Islamabad to also think of doing the same. You can say that there is maybe direct pressure as well, but I would say that at this stage, it's indirect. Relations were already they face difficulties between the UAE and Pakistan because of the pandemic, when several flights that brought Pakistani workers home from the UAE, they had close to 80 or 90 people who were tested positive. And Pakistan had no facilities, so there were some differences on that. And recently, the UAE has put Pakistan in the list of countries to which they are not going to issue visas any longer. So I don't think so. The relationship will be the same. I do have confidence that, like in the past, perhaps they'll manage to deal with their differences, the UAE and Pakistan, but their relationship with Israel will be, I think, a key deciding factor in future. Bahrain is another country that has normalized relations with Israel recently through the Abraham Accords signed just recently through the US mediation. But with Bahrain also, Pakistan has been having very good relations, historic relations involving mainly defense collaboration as well. There is a small proportion of Pakistan's workforce there as well. But the defense relations have been very important, considering how during the Arab Spring also Pakistan provided support to the Bahrain's government. And that has been appreciated a lot. Pakistan has close to 100,000 workers in Bahrain. So while now there are some hiccups in Pakistan's relations with these three GCC states, with Saudi Arabia, also recently we saw that Saudi Arabia asked for the repayments of the loans given to Pakistan. Interestingly, Pakistan reached out to Beijing and borrowed money from them to repay to Saudi Arabia. So that is like unprecedented. And I think the writing is on the wall for Pakistan that it cannot take Saudi Arabia for granted for long. And Saudi Arabia is using also its leverage here to pressurize Islamabad. And there can be many issues on which Saudi Arabia can actually pressurize Pakistan to meet its demands. There is already talk of perhaps Pakistan's relations with Israel as well. In Islamabad, this has there has been this ongoing discussion on these issues. But now I'll talk about Pakistan's relations with Iran. So during the time of the Shah, Pakistan had very cooperative relations with Iran. In fact, Iran helped Pakistan establish close collaboration with the United States. But since the Islamic Revolution and due to the rise of sectarian violence in Pakistan, there have been a lot of differences. And the relations have been ever since, facing a lot of difficulties. And the India factor is also crucial here, considering Pakistan's inherent insecurities involving India, and how India has invested heavily in the Chabahar port in Iran. And Pakistan has concerns in relation to how India can use its port in Iran for covert operations in Pakistan. Pakistan has in fact recently provided a full file including evidences to the media and also send them to the United Nations. So these have been concerns, and also the Baloch insurgency and the non-state actors that are involved. They have always created difficulties for the relationship between Iran and Pakistan. But interestingly, what has changed recently in this relationship is the China factor, and how Pakistan has very, very close, and in Pakistan they call it, also in Beijing they call it all-weather friendship between China and Pakistan. They call it, they use many, many phrases to explain the relationship. But what has happened is that China has signed a deal worth $200 billion. There can be different figures associated to that. With Iran, they have signed a deal, and there's some hope that through that indirectly Pakistan will also be a beneficiary, and that may also help Pakistan improve its relations with Iran. And now I'll move on to the options for Pakistan in this sort of context, where it has difficulties in terms of relations with the three GCC states that I've talked about, and also Iran. But Pakistan has first its domestic considerations. Pakistan cannot afford to have bad relations with Iran for various reasons. There has never been this desire to open another front than India in terms of conflicts in the neighborhood. And Pakistan has, it's a neighborhood full of turmoil and conflicts. So there's no desire to have conflict with Iran. At the same time, considering the demographic dynamic that Pakistan is home to the second largest Shia population, Pakistan is aware of these sensitivities that it cannot completely go against Iran as well. Even by siding with Saudi Arabia, which it has sided for a very, very long time. So then Pakistan is naturally left with the option of mediating between Iran and the GCC states, because there is no other option. Pakistan, of course, historically has been claiming neutrality because, and it realizes that it cannot be neutral. So it has claimed neutrality that has helped in some ways by telling Iran that we are not against you, and by telling also GCC states that we are not against you as well, because we are economically dependent on GCC states, for example. So that's the kind of message Pakistan has been giving. And this rhetoric, in my opinion, has helped Pakistan achieve something. That still manages to have some kind of cooperation with all these actors who have conflicts with each other. There is, there are regular official visits involving all these states and Pakistan. And Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, for the past 2 years, he has been claiming that Pakistan has been mediating between Iran and Saudi Arabia. He went to Tehran, and from Tehran, he went to, just like Ziaul Haq's shuttle diplomacy in the 80s. Imran Khan has also been engaged in shuttle diplomacy between Tehran and involving Tehran and Riyadh, although we have seen no positive outcomes of those, but that suits Pakistan, considering the domestic politics as well, that it is trying to play a key role in terms of bringing the Ummah together. So that's the kind of rhetoric that has been in Pakistan, promoted by various political parties and also the military, that Pakistan has to be unifying factor in the Ummah. And this is the role that Pakistan has been playing. But at the same time, Pakistan has realized in terms of its foreign policy options that when India can equally enjoy good relations with Iran and the Gulf countries, then why can't Pakistan do the same? So I think there is this puzzle that policymakers in Pakistan are trying to address. In future, I think Pakistan will rely a lot on China's sort of inroads into the GCC region or the Persian Gulf, and how Pakistan can benefit from that. But as John also said, I don't think so. China aims to change the existing security infrastructure in the Gulf region or the Middle East. I think they want the US to deal with whatever is happening there. So for Pakistan, I think it's going to be to wait and see. In the meantime, I think Pakistan will continue to try to resolve these issues or differences or conflicts within the Muslim world, especially between Iran and the GCC countries. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور زاهد.
Thank you, Dr. Zahid. It seems that Dr. Daher Al-Ajmi still facing technical difficulties, so I will seize the opportunity to comment on some of the issues that were mentioned, and I have been following the relations between Iran and the Gulf for a very long time. I would like to start with what Dr. Zahid said regarding Pakistan and the mediation between Iran and GCC and Saudi Arabia. In reality, the Saudi-Pakistani relation is witnessing an autumn or a fall since the decisive storm operation in Yemen, when Saudi Arabia asked the assistance of Pakistan, but the parliament in Pakistan refused. And it was clear because of the majority of Shia MPs, and also the demographic map in Pakistan. And it was unsatisfactory in Saudi Arabia. This is why Saudi Arabia had to choose a retired military leader from Pakistan to lead the operations and say that Pakistan is there. And this was an important chapter in the relation between the two countries. And I think that this was the thing that affected the relation and led to the tipping point. I disagree with Zahid when it comes to the mediation between so this mediation. So Riyadh had change in the relation with Tehran and built a strong relationship. Pakistan built a strong relationship with China, and I think that the Pakistani-Saudi relation that was known in the 20th century, I think that it is on its way to decline and maybe a total destruction of the relation. But there is an increasing invisible tension. Imran Khan as a personality, maybe Saudi Arabia is trying to also work on the military, and Imran Khan was not uh, happy with the relationship between Saudi and the military of Pakistan, and there was some mistrust at this level. Iran, in reality, has a problem with local mediators. They always. The Omani mediation, for instance, was accepted by Iran because what Oman did when it comes to the nuclear program. Oman was a facilitator. It wasn't a mediation effort. It was just a facilitator's effort that brought together different parties. But there's a difference between this and what Imran Khan was talking about, which is mediation. Iran has this concern that Pakistan is a nuclear Islamic power, and also has concerns vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia with Kaaba and the Medina. So there is a competition with the two Sunni powers in the political religious context. So it is a problematic relation between this triangle, and there was tension in the previous years, despite some level of diplomatic relations between these parties. And here, I would like to encourage the participants to write down their questions in the Q&A section, and there will be the opportunity to answer the questions, and also other participants can raise their hands. I would like to comment on what John mentioned regarding the redefinition of the U.S. role in the region. I think that there is a problem between the Gulf and the Democrats in general. The Democrats have a different vision relying on institutions, and the institutions, of course, have principles, have certain principles, human rights, democracy, development, etc. And it could be problematic when it comes to the relation with some Gulf countries, and some other Gulf countries could benefit. For the Republicans, there is power for the individual voices. For instance, the relation between Trump and Saudi Arabia and the UAE was based on his persona, and without a total partnership with the institutions. And we need to follow this closely in the 4 years to come. How will the Biden administration redefine the relation with the Gulf? We remember that the Democrats during the Obama administration signed the JCPOA, and this upset the Gulf countries. So the history is maybe not the best when it comes to the attitude or the behavior of Democrat presidents vis-a-vis the Gulf, and they have a set of ideologies that they believe in, and this could create a problematic relations in the future. But redefining the relations is important, and this reminds me of the role of the UK in the 50s and the 60s by redefining its role in the Gulf. And I encourage people who work on establishing this comparison when it comes to redefining the role of the United States. What did the Great Britain do post World War II to redefine, to reshape the reposition the role and all these things with this part of the world. So I think that we are witnessing a turning point when it comes to the Gulf and the United States. Do we have any questions from the participants? There is a question addressed to Dr. John. The question is in English, and it says, so basically the question is followers of the regional developments may witness decrease of U.S. engagement in the region. To what extent the Biden administration will be re-engaged once again, knowing that Trumpism's influence will remain at least for time Biden's re-engagement process would start. So how will the Biden administration become more active when it comes to its role in the Gulf or the Middle East? Go ahead, John.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I think there are several factors I think that I would mention in response to the question, which I think suggest that the Biden administration will re-engage relatively quickly after the inauguration. I mean, one thing is President-elect Biden himself, who I perceive to be a pragmatist, an internationalist, an Atlanticist, someone who will re-engage European allies. Now, how does this relate to the Gulf in particular and to the Iran-GCC confrontation? Biden himself, in a recent essay, said that he was prepared to re-enter the JCPOA. In order to do that, he's going to have to bring the European allies of the United States on board with him. But he has already, and his team is already sort of predisposed to doing that. So my guess is that one of the first initiatives is going to be precisely that. And I think that Foreign Minister Zarif, for his own part, responded somewhat favorably when he was quoted as saying that if the United States were to re-enter the JCPOA, that Iran would comply, that there was no need for additional negotiations. So for me, that would be like a first step. I don't think it would be the only step that the Biden administration necessarily would take or should take. I think that there would be maybe several parallel diplomatic initiatives going on at one time. One, to re-engage the European allies so that they can sort of assist, support, and help to bridge differences. Two, that the Biden administration itself would make the overture that it said it would to state that it would re-enter the JCPOA. Three, that the Biden team and some kind of reconstituted State Department, which is not as hawkish as the one led by Secretary Pompeo, would reach out to Gulf Arab security partners for the very reasons that I mentioned earlier in my talk, which was to sort of attempt to demonstrate that the United States is not disengaging, that it doesn't, take their individual and collective security interests vis-a-vis Iran anything but seriously.
شكرا جون.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, John.
John, there is a question which says that President Biden maybe he will be preoccupied in the first months of his presidency with the internal situation with COVID-19, improving the economy, so much so that until the summer of 2021, the foreign policy will not be a priority to him. Do you agree?
I agree and disagree at the same time, which is a typical academic response to any question, right? So I agree. I think that priority number one has to be dealing with the health crisis, which if you're following news in the United States, it's not getting any better. In fact, it's getting significantly worse, though there is light at the end of the tunnel. And the light at the end of the tunnel is the incredible progress that's being made in the development of several vaccines, assuming that the obstacles, and there are obstacles to the logistical distribution of these vaccines, moves relatively expeditiously, then I think that the American economy is sort of poised for recovery. There'll be a lot of pent-up demand. Sure, there'll be a lot of other things that need to be done in order to sort of, lubricate or readjust the economy. So I agree with that completely. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, because President Biden himself or the team that is focused on economic issues, the task force that he's already named to deal with the health crisis, that those things sort of prevent the foreign policy machinery and the team that he's assembled, who are seasoned individuals, experienced, know him, know his priorities, know the region, that they're going to be paralyzed by this. The other thing I would say is that I mentioned in my talk, and I would repeat it here because I think it's very important. All of us are anxious to end the nightmare of the pandemic. All of us are, at least I am anxious to end the confrontation between Iran and the GCC states. But I don't think that we should let our anxieties or the urgency of the moment lead us to underestimate that these kinds of diplomatic initiatives take time. And so while it's true, I think, that the Biden administration's foreign policy team will take steps to sort of establish the groundwork for progress, you're not going to see any, I hope we would, but I think we will see no major breakthroughs in the first 6 months. I think we should be looking more at the first 2 years or the first year. And the other reason I would say that is there's an election in Iran in June 2021. So we don't know exactly how that's going to play out, what individual is going to come to the fore, whether, any members of Foreign Minister Zarif's team will sort of survive that electoral process. And so I think that, the first 6 months are going to be spent laying the groundwork with European allies, re-engaging GCC Arab partners, making a statement, making good on his pledge to re-enter the GCPOA and see how the Iranians respond.
Thank you, John. عماد قدورة لو سمحت. تفضل أستاذ عماد.
عماد قدورة, the floor is yours.
Unmute yourself. الميكروفون.
افتح الميكروفون رجاء.
شكرا جزيلا للمتحدثين.
Thank you very much for the two panelists. These were very important interventions. I have two clarifications and one question to Dr. Zahid. Pakistan lately tried to free itself from the traditional alliance between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries and tried to improve its relations with Iran to create some sort of a balance in the relations between Iran and the Gulf countries. So also Pakistan came up with different initiatives so far as the Gulf security is concerned to keep and maintain its presence and offered mediating role, like, for example, Nawaz Sharif suggested persons to coordinate between Riyadh, Tehran, and Islamabad. And the second mediation was in summer 2017, when Pakistan offered to mediate in the inter GCC dispute. The Saudis refused the Pakistani attempt. Also, in 2018, there was an attempt by Pakistan when Imran Khan, the prime minister, offered to mediate into the crisis of Yemen when he was visiting Saudi Arabia in October 2018, but the mediation did not achieve anything. My question is, what has changed Pakistan's role from one based on a traditional alliance with the Saudis and stood when Pakistan stood by Saudi Arabia since the 60s until the beginning of this century, where Pakistan stood by the Saudis militarily, into the current way that rather than being an ally of Saudi Arabia as such? Dr. Zahid, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think these are very important questions. So I try to
Dr.
address
Zahid.
them.
Dr. Zahid.
Hello.
Just let me. There is another question related to that. Let me just say it, and then you can take them together. There's a question now I received. حول التكلفة المتوقعة.
This is about the cost, the possible cost if Pakistan followed a foreign policy which differentiated between the Gulf and Iran, took one side over the other. What cost will that be for Pakistan if that happened?
Thank you. So it's good that you have combined the questions because they are definitely related to each other. So I'll first talk about the possible costs. So the costs are going to be very, very high because looking at the economic potential of GCC states and you compare it with Iran, which is under international sanctions, there's a huge difference. Of course, Pakistan has maintained some level of trade with Iran, which is all informal between the province of Balochistan and Iran. If you go to Balochistan, the oil there is much, much cheaper because it's all smuggled across the border from Iran. So there is a different kind of economy there. But as far as the trade is concerned, there are limitations because of the international sanctions. The whole pipeline project could not go ahead. Iran has built the pipeline on its side, and they in fact threatened Pakistan to go to the international court because Pakistan has not built its part of the pipeline, the gas pipeline. So there, these are just some indications of the level of relationship and why Pakistan cannot fully shift away from the GCC. So my answer to Brother Ahmed Kadora here, that why it seems like that Pakistan is shifting, but Pakistan is, I think, it's not one option or the other. It's both for Pakistan, I think. And as I mentioned before, foreign policies are, they correspond with countries' national interests. So here we look at Pakistan's national interest. I talked about Pakistan's domestic politics and demographics as well. Pakistan is really sick of sectarian violence. That's one factor. Brother Mahjoob talked about Pakistan's parliament's decision. Interestingly, in the parliament, the Shias are not, I think, more than 4 to 5 in terms of the joint session that held on the Yemen issue. Many of the majority Sunni senators and parliamentarians, they voted against sending the troops to Saudi Arabia. Of course, the decision was reversed later on, but you're right, it played a key role. So in terms of what direction Pakistan is taking now, Pakistan's interest is in maintaining good relations between the both the GCC countries and also Iran, because from Iran also it has understood that it cannot turn Iran against Pakistan, because India, of course, has now managed to develop very, very good relations with Iran. There have been spies, Indian spies that have come into Pakistan. They had security.
يبدو أن هناك مشكلة في الصوت مع زاهد. كان هناك
We have good relations with both parties. And then I think another aspect I want to say in relation to the mediation, that Pakistan has no other choice also other than the mediation. There's a lot of symbolism in the manner in which Pakistan claims that it is mediating. Whether Saudi Arabia rejects it, whether Iran rejects it, doesn't matter. As far as domestic politics is concerned, it sells very well. So this is a reputation from what I had already said. But I think this is where I would end, that Pakistan is a weak state with inherent security dilemmas, especially in relation to India. It cannot afford to have more enemies. It wants to have more friends, and the friends who can give it money, through which Pakistan can develop and also modernize its military. These have been the key features of Pakistan's, national interests and foreign policy ever since its independence in 1947.
دكتور زاهد، هناك سؤال أيضا. الصراع.
There is another question. The struggle in Yemen is sometimes described as a war by proxy. The Houthis fight on behalf of Iran. What is Pakistan's evaluation of the Yemen crisis? Do you really think, or do you agree it's a war by proxy?
Yes, definitely. I would recall the parliament's proceedings when they first talked about sending troops to Yemen. And these examples were shared by many of the parliamentarians who talked that Iran is supporting its proxy Houthis in Yemen. And if Pakistan would support Saudi Arabia, then it would automatically mean that Pakistan is, fighting against Iran. And in fact, then Jawad Zarif came to Islamabad and met with the chairperson of Pakistan's parliament. And just a couple of days before Pakistan had made the decision not to send the troops. And I think he wanted to, and he gave this message to Pakistan to not get involved in this, conflict in the Middle East. I think that was the message to Pakistan that might have played some role, but I think the parliamentarians were more concerned with Pakistan's own stability. This was a time also, I must also mention that Pakistan was deep in this war against terrorism at home. And Pakistan had already, I think by then, lost 60,000 lives because of the terrorism. And the military was also not interested in another engagement. Although the parliament decided, the civilian side decided on not to send the troops, but I think the military had also said that they were not in a position to send troops abroad because there was this, a war against terrorism. You talk about Baloch insurgency on one side. You talk about, terrorism incidents. And I was living in Pakistan then, and, there was not a single day without a terrorist attack in the country. And now we see this improvement that, there are maybe one or two attacks in a year. There is a huge improvement from where Pakistan has come. And I think the military's desire was also to not engage in any other conflict. But of course, Pakistan reversed its decision. And I've in fact written a paper on this in the Muslim world, that how there was a pressure mainly from the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And Pakistan then ultimately joined the coalition, the military coalition, as a member. And then its former military chief was also given a an official approval from the government to join the Saudi-led military as its chief.
اوكي دكتور زاهد شكرا جزيلا. نعرف اذا هناك اي اسئله.
Thank you. I don't know if you have any more questions now, or the participants, if anybody wants the floor to comment or to pose a question. There is a question by Murad. Murad, we ask this question in English, in fact. Murad?
أنا أود الحقيقة أن أشير إلى أنه
I just want to mention that in the last 4 years, there was a new environment created in the Gulf Iranian relationships, not because of the nuclear deal, but also due to the division and the rift within the GCC. Maybe this is the first time in the 21st century that such thing happens, and it serves as a reminder of similar internal crises like the invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and problems within the Arab environment, which can play a bigger role in influencing events than the outside factors, and how the outside forces manage to turn that to their advantage. And it's often said that there was no Gulf crisis and the boycott of Qatar, maybe Iran couldn't have become a bigger player as it is now. Since the boycott of Qatar, there is an indication that there are other powers active in the region which are not Arab, like Turkey, for example, as well as Iran, of course. And so this is something noticeable, like other powers emerge now in their role. Russia, for example, India, China before. For example, the relations between India and the UAE, how it's been developing. Now the Israeli-Emirati relations, now there are projects being thought of to link Abu Dhabi, Delhi, and Tel Aviv. And this is maybe something which calls for more research and looking into by analysts to see what kind of developments would result. We have a question now. This is to both panelists, whoever wants to answer. In the Obama administration period, there was talk of America wants to depart the region as a main player. Maybe John can answer this. Why do you think now that Biden's policy would be different than that of Obama, and what makes you think that he would want to re-engage now? John?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not too sure that I agree that Obama's, priority was disengagement. But that aside, I mean, I think that President-elect Biden has made it pretty clear. Of course, it's always possible, as it is with any politician, that once in power, they may steer a policy and behave in a way that diverges greatly from what their campaign promises were. But Biden is clearly an internationalist and a multilateralist. And I think what he has in common with Obama, and actually what they have in common with me, is that the nature of problems that afflict the Gulf, and for that matter, that afflict all of us in a globalized world, and I think if nothing else, the COVID-19 pandemic clearly underscores that, is that big problems can't be solved by big countries, by no single country. And so I think, what encourages me about Biden, and I think if in fact he does follow through on what his tendencies appear to be, is that he and his team will engage major powers. And that they have a particular view as to who those traditional partners are. And I think that they see demand signals from those powers, from the UK, from France, for Germany, for the United States to lead. But, as Obama said, and I think as Biden believes, it's not the kind of leadership that would necessarily require the United States, particularly in this sort of phase of its own development and in the way that the world has evolved, to assume the burden, I guess you could say, the costs, however you want to, whatever metrics you want to use to define that word, on its own. And so, I think what you're going to see is a pendulum swing away from the Trump approach, which was unilateralist. I think you're going to see a pendulum swing away from this, high degree of personalized diplomacy. And, that might be a good thing. I'm sure that it has, in some ways, maybe, developed some level of familiarity and confidence with key leaders in the Gulf. But I don't think you're going to see that from the Biden administration.
Thank you, John. We have more questions now. I just received. Okay. سؤال
Question is directed to John. If we speak about a war by proxy, which is going on, to what extent can we consider the Egyptian regime a main player in view of its relations with the Gulf countries, that is Egypt's relations with the Gulf countries? Another question to
إلى أي مدى
to what extent will the American and Israeli influence will influence Pakistan? This is a question maybe to Zahid. And we start with John, first of all, and his question. John, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, please excuse me. I'm not really, well, probably not an expert at anything, but I'm not really an expert on Egyptian foreign policy and specifically Egypt's sort of past role, current role, prospective role in Gulf affairs. But I would say this. I think Egypt's got enough problems, both in terms of its sort of, domestic situation, particularly on the economic side, but also its very uneasy relations with Ethiopia regarding the Renaissance Dam, and just seeing from, and I don't follow it as closely as I should, just seeing how relations between Egypt and Sudan appear to be playing out, and how that probably has something significant to do with Ethiopia and Egypt's sort of relationship with Ethiopia and the water issue. I'm not sure how much bandwidth Egypt has to play the kind of role that maybe some of its Gulf brothers and sisters would necessarily like it to play. And that's just on one side. On the other side, you've got what's going on in Libya. So I'm not too sure what one can, realistically expect from Egypt in terms of Egypt playing a leading role, if by leading role you're talking about, either on the diplomatic side or on the military side.
You're on mute, but are you asking me to respond to the other question?
Zahid, yes, I mean, yes, you please, yes.
زاهد نعم زاهد. Go ahead
Okay.
زاهد.
Thank you.
So the question was السؤال كان حول تأثير النفوذ الأمريكي
The
والإسرائيلي.
question was the impact of American and Israeli influence on Pakistan's foreign relations. And quickly, if you may, please.
So I'll quickly address this because I've already spoken about how Israeli, peace agreements with the Gulf countries can influence Pakistan's relations with the GCC. America and Israel's relationship is nothing new, but the developments in the UAE's and Bahrain and Saudi relationship with Israel are new. I think Pakistan is just closely watching. And as I mentioned before, Pakistan is not in a position to dictate any of these GCC states to formulate their foreign policies. So for now, it has decided to stay quiet. But at the same time, there have been already talks in many circles in Islamabad that there is now pressure from GCC states on Pakistan also to recognize Israel, which is highly unlikely considering how it is central to Pakistan's foreign policy and also identity, considering, for example, the Kashmir issue, its position on the Kashmir issue, its position on the Rohingyas issue. Of course, its position on Muslims in China is very problematic because there is no position. But of course, Pakistan cannot easily take a U-turn on these identity-related issues, for example, involving Muslims in Palestine. Pakistan is home to, in fact, the biggest Palestinian embassy. Not many people know that, which is in Islamabad. So it's not that easy for Pakistan to normalize the relations. Of course, maybe Pakistan's military would like to not have another enemy, which is Israel is a strong, it has a strong military. But I think the civilian government would have a different position on this issue. And they are just watching how it is going, and perhaps might not be bothered by how UAE and Bahrain have normalized relations with Israel, because Pakistan is economically dependent on the UAE and Saudi Arabia. If the relations go south, as they say, imagine these 2 million workers, Pakistani workers, coming back home from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That would be like another national crisis in the country. So the costs are very high. So I think Pakistan has chosen the wise option of staying quiet by not trying to dictate the GCC states at this stage.
Thank you so much. شكرا جزيلا دكتور زاهد. في نهاية هذه الجلسة.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zahid and Dr. John. I would like to thank you both, Dr. Zahid Shahab Ahmed and Dr. John Calabrese. We also like to thank all the participants for taking part and your interaction. And we thank the Arab Center for organizing this event. And we have another session at 6:15 in about 45 minutes from now. So please be with us, and may the blessings of God be upon you all.
Shukran. Thank you, Dr. Mahjoob.